Alrighty, welcome to another week of Taxes and Retirement Live. Another exciting special guest for you all this week. I'm here with Brian Williams of Northshire Consulting in Southington, Connecticut. Hello, Brian.
Hey guys, how you doing?
Good. Thanks for coming on. Good to have you today.
Sure,
Brian.
absolutely.
So Brian, you know the drill. I got to start with the disclosure here for the sake of both of us. This video is only general explanations and education. It's not specific tax, legal, or investment advice. Before considering acting on anything you see or hear here, first consult with your tax, legal, or investment advisor. Thank you very much. And Brian, as you know, dad jokes are my thing. I'd be remiss if I did not start with some. So I actually have a special write-in from a group member. And the joke is, when does a joke become a dad joke, Brian? Any ideas?
Oh, I don't know. Probably when it makes it onto your script, right?
Almost. When the answer becomes apparent. Yeah. See what I did there? Yeah.
That's great.
Good. I'm so irritated with my neighbor today. He kept playing Lionel Richie songs at full blast. Normally I wouldn't mind, but it was all night long. All night. All right. And finally, I got fired from my job at the calendar factory. All I did was take a day off. You have one job as a calendar. That job is to count the days. All right. So yeah, thank you for that. Again, here with Brian Williams, Northshire Consulting in Southington, Connecticut. Brian is a fee-only fiduciary advisor, and today we'll be talking all about employer retirement plans. Brian?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I appreciate that. So yeah, I've been an advisor for about 20 years now. I always tell everybody I started in the year 2000 just to keep the math easy. You know, it made it much easier. I could always tell how long I've been in the business. But yeah, primarily focused in the retirement plan space for the last 15 years or so. And a couple of years ago, decided to go out on my own and really focus on the local market and the small business retirement space, because as Andy and I were talking a little bit before we went live, there's a lot of bad plans out there. There's a lot of old plans. So for me, you know, doing this 15 years or so, I'd say that the last year and a half, it's been a pretty exciting time. I guess as exciting as you could get in the retirement plan space, but between some new legislation that's come out, you know, this had the association retirement plan ruling last summer, and then at the end of the year you had the Secure Act, which among other things allowed for some significant tax credits for small businesses to start up. There's been a lot of action on the technology side, competitive fee pressure wise on the record keeping and asset management. You know, all those index funds are always ticking a basis point lower. So all this stuff, I mean, 90% of the stuff that's come out has really been good for retirement plans and ultimately really good for the retirement plan participants. So for people that have plans, you know, they need to get updated. They need to be reviewed on a regular basis. So, you know, normally we'd say every 3 to 5 years, you sit down and go through your plan. But really, if it hasn't been looked at in the last year or so, you kind of have to take a look, not just at your plan and look at what's out there. So, you know, Andy's done a lot of good stuff on fiduciary responsibility and things like that on the individual side. But those same sort of principles exist in the retirement plan space. And when you're a plan fiduciary, plan sponsor, you know, essentially business owner, when you're a business owner, you have to operate in the best interest of your participants. So a lot of times that's in line with your goals as a business owner too. But sometimes there's actually some conflicts there, or some procedures that you should follow that are in best interest of clients. So I always say, you know, if you want to have your copy machine done by your cousin or your landscaping done by your neighbor, that's fine. But if you're using those same criteria to select your retirement plan structure, it's not going to hold up. You really have to do your due diligence. You know, I have, you know, potential clients who will say to me, no, everything's working fine. We've had our same setup for, you know, 10 years and everything's great. So they're mainly just looking at market returns and saying my account's been up and, you know, everything's fine, but doesn't always work that way. You do have to do your due diligence and operate in the best interest of participants. So, so that's something that you run into quite a bit.
And I guess as participants, people, you know, employees, those who are investing in these plans, for the most part, people probably don't know what they don't know, right? They assume they have a 401k plan or a 403b plan at work. They invest in it, may or may not get a match, and don't really ask other questions beyond what are the investment options, right?
Yeah, and some of the bigger mistakes is, I work for a big company. They must know what they're doing. This
Mm,
in 2020, we've had 5 times more Erisa lawsuits just on excessive fees than we've had in any other year because people are home, they're looking at their statements.
yeah.
We had the market volatility earlier in the year, so it's been a hot topic this year is all the Erisa lawsuits, and they're not from employers that employers you would think should know better are sort of making these mistakes. And I look at these ERISA cases in the lawsuits, and some of them have some validity, some of them don't. But you'll see share classes in a plan with a multi-billion-dollar firm that'll just blow your mind that they're not even the institutional level share classes.
Right.
So that's just a lot of sloppy work like that, or companies that grew very quickly. Maybe you had an internet startup, and then you had 10 employees that weren't making any money, and a couple of years later you got 500 employees, and you haven't adjusted your plan for that. So you're seeing a lot of that too. So I'd say the big company issue is one that you run into a lot. And the other thing is, if you're young or you just started your job, the last thing you're going to do your first week on the job is run in and say, my expense ratios are too high, so there's a little
Right.
bit of that. And a lot of times in the smaller business, the business owner is the one that's successful, that has a nice house, that has a nice
Mm,
car. So, who am I to say as a, 23-year-old that our plan is no good? He must know what he's doing because
right.
he's
Yeah.
wealthy. But that's a mistake too, because a lot of times they're worried about a million other things, health insurance and things like that need to be
Right.
renewed every year, and 401k gets put on the back burner. So,
Yeah.
um,
I guess as an employee slash participant, I mean, what are some things people could or should try to realistically do? Now, not, to your point, not everyone's going to be willing and able to stand up and be like, this plan's terrible, we got to revamp it. But, basic due diligence that someone should be doing. Where do you kind of start with that?
Yeah, and that's something that you and I talked about when we were putting this together. We don't want to just target tonight, business owners or just target employees. We almost want to educate the employees as if they are the decision makers,
Yeah.
as if they are the business owners and HR staff. So I think understanding your plan, understanding the components. Obviously, this is a super smart group, and you get a lot of good, feedback here. And just by reading the comments, this is not your average group. You guys know what you're talking about here. But I think it's just understanding the plan, understanding the components, and even sometimes looking at it from an advisor's point of view, or even from sort of the record keeping. One of the things that's a challenge in the 401k space is you've just got a lot of people that you have to deal with. From a regulatory standpoint, obviously you've got IRS because you're filing 5,500 tax forms every
Yeah.
year. You've got your Department of Labor because it's a DOL issue. You've got maybe FINRA if you're working with a broker, or you maybe SEC or state registration, and then you've got your record keeper, your funds, your administration, your advisor, and then on the business side you've got employees. And so you almost have to put yourself in each one of those positions if you're a good advisor, and I like to think that I am, but sort of sit in that position and say, all right, if I'm a regulator, how am I picking this plan apart? If I'm an employer, am I working in the best interest? If I was the 22-year-old putting away $10 a week, is this plan good for me? If I'm the 65-year-old with $1 million in the account, is the plan good for me? So you've got a lot of different perspectives to look at it from. But from an employee standpoint, I mean, I think it's to get that fee disclosure. It's they have to make those available. As I said to Andy last night, they have to make them available, not necessarily readily available. You would hope that they're right there on the website, but sometimes they're not. Look at your investment options, and then look at sort of the add-ons if they're there, or revenue sharing, which we'll talk about a little bit more. But it's just educating yourself on the components, how they charge, what they're charging, and is that fee reasonable?
And is that all more or less standardized set of information, from one plan to the other? Are these documents things that the plans have to have and have to put in a certain format? Or are they going to bury all this info so deep and so hard to find that people give up trying to get it?
Yeah, I mean, there's certain formats they're supposed to be in. There's certain data points that they're supposed to give you, as far as performance, expense ratio. But each one of these fee disclosures comes from a record keeper that's in a completely different format. So
Okay.
I always say if you can't explain it on one page, you need to get it down to one page, So whenever I go in and look at a plan, I'll try to break it down on one page. Here's your record keeping costs, here's your investment costs, your advisor costs, and just really spell it out on one page. Leave, the disclosure and all the fine print, in another section. But it should be, if I were to wave my magic wand and redo the fee disclosure regulations, I'd have a one page, almost like, like an IRS tax form. Right. Here's your numbers, fill it in and let's see what we're doing. So, but no, they are different from each record keeper. So that is something you'll have to take a look at.
But they do need to be made available in some form or fashion, right?
Yeah. So you'd hope that they're on your website, the record keeping website. Some of them, they do make you call and they'll mail it to you and that kind of stuff. Okay. Most of the information you should be able to pull off a statement. Where it gets a little crazy is if they do an annual fee, so it might not show up on that particular quarter. Got it. So that kind of stuff. But the fee disclosure document should be available to you, and that's where I'd start.
Okay. So we have a question here from Brenda, Brian. I mean, I guess not specifically about what makes a plan good or bad, but question is, do people leave 401ks and company plans after retiring?
Yeah, that's a good question, and you see that a lot on forums like this. And 99% of the time, it's absolutely roll it out, because you're paying record keeping and administration for a company that you don't work for, basically. I'd say that the caveats here is one thing that's overlooked a lot is don't sleep on the stable value fund. If you've got a stable value fund in there, a lot of them, especially older contracts, might even have a 3% minimum. As far as the interest that they're paying on that stable value fund. So, so if you can do a partial withdrawal, maybe, but don't give up on that stable value option if it's available to you. So if you've got less than $500, the employer can just force you out and send you a check. If you've got between 500 and 5,000, they can force you out, but they have to open up an IRA for you. But if you've got more than 5,000, you could stay in there as long as you want. So the issues there are, keep an eye on that stable value fund, especially if you're somebody who's a little bit older, because you may not be able to replicate that on the outside. Last thing I want to do is see somebody pull money from a stable value fund and then, be in some aggregate bond index or something that may not be able to replicate that as well. So take advantage of that if it's available. The other issue right now is, data security. So as people have different accounts floating around out there, that's just another login you've got to remember. It's another potential statement or a system that could be hacked. So that might factor into consolidation. So, and the other thing is you want to look at the services and things that are provided, just like any other benefit. You want to make sure you're taking full advantage of that. So if you've got a really good advisor on the plan, and it's sort of included in that benefits package, then maybe you want to keep your money there and continue to use that advisor. As an advisor, you have participants. So I think that's an important vocabulary term. When you say participants, that could include employees, but also, terminated employees as well. So as an advisor, I can't discriminate against, well, you don't work there anymore, so I'm not taking your phone call. I really don't have the ability to do that. So, I would say that the standard is to roll your money out, and most often that makes sense, but keep an eye on that stable value fund. And if you've got good benefits system there, if the employer is maybe paying all the record keeper and the administration, and you're just paying for, the fees and the advice, it might be worth keeping there.
Yeah. Can you just touch on more about stable value funds? So we had a question in the group handful of months ago, and someone basically asked, how can I get this access myself on a retail side? Because he's only seeing it in his kids 529 or employer plan. So just at a high level, what is a stable value fund, and why is the interest that it pays, if why is it so much better than a CD or something that we can get ourselves?
Yeah, so they're typically tied to the general accounts of an insurance company. So they're collecting premiums on their, car insurance and home insurance. They have to invest that somewhere to get some sort of rate of return. So they have significant pools of assets, and they're time horizons that can be pretty lengthy on that. So a lot of times they're tied into that insurance pool. Like I said before, sometimes you had contracts that might have been done 10 or 15 years ago that had a floor on them of 3%. So if you've got that, take advantage of that. But it is very difficult, if not impossible, to replicate that on the outside, because it's actually a contract between the insurance company and the plan sponsor to have that available to them. So sometimes it may actually even be tough to move that stable value from one record keeper to another. If you can they may actually keep that stable value. So if you're with record keeper A using stable value A, and you change record keepers, they may be able to take that stable value fund without, liquidating it and buying on the other side. They may actually be able to move that, but
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, stable value fund is a really good option for, it's a really good advantage over, just money on the outside.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Good question from Jackie. Is there any way to roll over your 401k from a former employer to an IRA without liquidating the funds you're invested in?
Sometimes there is. That's sort of a rare scenario where they'll actually take the funds in kind. It's called in kind. So if you've got a 401k that's with company that's more of a traditional brokerage like a Schwab or a Fidelity, they may be able to do that for you. But typically it's for whatever reason, they've kind of changed the regulations on that, where they're actually more likely to mail people checks now, and then you got to go deposit it, which is sort of a pain, as you know. Whereas they used to go company to company, so you wouldn't have to worry about that. But sometimes you can. It's pretty rare, but in certain setups, some 401ks are actually, they might have a self-directed brokerage account feature where you, have that money on the outside, so you may be able to move those funds that are in that self-directed brokerage account into an IRA without having to liquidate them.
Yeah, that's good input. And it seems like if your 401k is at the same custodian as your IRA will be or is, then it's more likely that they can communicate across the accounts and just transfer over, right?
Right. And that's a point that ties into something else. Another question we got was on kind of jumping ahead on the outline here, but so something, collective investment trusts are finding their way into 401k plans. In my opinion, I'm not personally a big fan of them because they're a little bit more difficult to research. And in a group like this, who's, have pretty investment savvy, they like to put in those five letter tickers in Morningstar and poke around. But, in a CIT, you may not have that same ability to do that. So, they're doing it to save a basis point here or there. And I get it. We're in a fee conscious world and every basis point matters, but to give that up, I think is not the greatest idea. And a lot of times for, groups like this who may use some financial planning software and they're syncing outside accounts or doing imports and exports and all that kind of stuff, CITs are just a pain in the butt rather than having that five letter ticker that's available in the 401k. So that would be an instance where if you had collective trusts in your 401k, there's no mechanism to move those out really into an individual brokerage account. So, so having mutual funds in there, I think is another advantage.
And there was a question in the group a few weeks ago about CITs or collective investment trusts. Basically, I think the question was like, what are they? And correct me if I'm wrong, but my answer was it's loosely like a mutual fund in that it's a pooled pot of money that invests in the stocks in the S&P 500 or some other index. The difference is a mutual fund, as we all know them, are individual registered securities. They have their own ticker and unique identifier that can trade and port and move around. Collective investment trusts are, I don't want to say less regulated, but
no, that's an okay term to use because they don't have the same reporting requirements as a mutual fund. So part of that's how they save a couple basis points in the fee structures because they don't have to because they are less regulated. So, yeah.
And so if you have like an S&P 500 collective investment trust in your plan, it looks and acts, if you're a participant, it looks and acts like it's an S&P 500 mutual fund. But the difference is, as you said, when you go to leave it's not possible to roll that out because that's not its own standalone security. It's just like a pot within that fund, within that plan, right?
Right, and a lot of those collective trusts are specific to that company. So if you work for a mega, Fortune 100 company or something, they might have the ABC company S&P 500 fund instead of the BlackRock or the Vanguard S&P 5. So they might be specific to that company. You're seeing unitized type products on the target date fund side too. You're seeing that creep in a little bit more rather than using your standard target date funds. You're seeing special custom target date funds put together for individual businesses. But again, that's something that wouldn't be portable, and it's just for accounting, it's sort of a pain.
And I guess sort of related question. So we had someone ask earlier today or yesterday about the TSP or Thrift Savings Plan, which is sort of the 401k equivalent for federal employees. So the TSP was it 5 or 6 funds you can invest in, and that's it. Are those CITs? Because they're not tradable securities, right?
Right. I don't know if they're technically considered CITs, but they're definitely not mutual funds, but they are pooled. Definitely is a pooled type product. So they have, an international, I think a global, a large cap, and then a mid and small, I think, and then a couple on the bond side too. So, but yeah, I mean, super low expense ratios. And they have a target date type product there too. But yeah, great plan. So
cool. That's one other question about, can we move lump sum from Chris? Can we move lump sum pension to an IRA without taxes due at the time? Not really related to 401ks or other defined contribution plans like that, but I guess I'll jump in there and say, Chris, it depends. It depends if, that lump sum, was any of that your contribution, or was it purely employer contribution? May or may not be taxable when you move it. Kind of leave that one there. There's not a single answer to that question, unfortunately, Chris, but thank you for the question. Okay. What else?
So I get kind of back up a little bit, and we'll talk about the components of a 401k. So who are the 401k providers there? What does it actually mean to be a record keeper and administration and all that kind of stuff? So your record keeper, think of that as your chassis. They're producing your statements, they're producing the website, they're hopefully running the data security, right? Fingers crossed. You're hoping they don't get hacked. That's their job. That's their record keeping function, is to take in those assets from payroll and then purchase the investments that you've directed them to do. And then think of administration as more of the accounting piece of it. So they're running your testing to mean, make sure they're not top heavy, meaning the business owners are putting away too much money and the rest of the employees aren't, that type of thing. They're tracking vesting, they're tracking, hours and eligibility and that type of thing. So a lot of times that's, those two functions are combined together because it's so much of the same data, record keeping and administration. So in the industry, that's what's considered a bundled 401k. So record keeping and administration are all, together in one piece. To split that out is obviously called unbundled. Should have made a quiz there and give away a prize. But so that's what's considered unbundled. So you may have a record keeping platform, the chassis, and then have a local third-party administrator who's focused more on that task of the vesting and that sort of thing. So I don't necessarily have an opinion one way or another there. The reason you would have a local TPA is maybe you've had that TPA for a long time. You've got a relationship there. Maybe you have some plan design issues that are a little bit different, or maybe you have a cash balance plan that's sort of married to that and your TPA is running that. So you might have that kind of off to the side. So that's a reason why you would unbundle just that local sort of TPA relationship. So that's sort of the common structure you'll see there. Obviously, you have your investment vehicles too, so mutual funds, your collective trusts, even some ETFs sometimes, and also the self-directed brokerage accounts are sometimes available where you can go in and buy stocks and bonds, CDs, whatever you want to do there on the self-directed side. So that's pretty standard, those investment options. And then your third component would be the advice component or the education component. And I think on that side, that's obviously where I am, but that's where the largest, I call it spectrum of service comes in. So you could have an advisor who's just simply choosing the investments for the plan, doesn't really have any interaction with the business owner or the employees. Or you could have, somebody who's on the far end of the spectrum, who's in there every quarter, who's sitting in the break room, who's doing, quarterly meetings for the whole staff, doing one-on-ones, doing virtual, really more of kind of a financial literacy or workplace financial planning, however you want to define that. But that's kind of that array of that spectrum of service there. So, so the key there is you just want to benchmark. If you're benchmarking the advisor, you want to make sure you're benchmarking them against the appropriate service level that they're providing. If they're charging 0.5% and they're doing, workplace financial planning for everybody, that's probably a pretty good deal. If they're charging 0.5% and they're just picking funds and have no interaction with the employees, then that's probably pretty expensive.
Not a good deal.
So, yeah. So you do actually, sometimes that advisory component of it is split up. So you will actually have one company that just chooses the investments and takes fiduciary responsibility for those. So that's what's called an Erisa 338. That's the investment manager component. So, so those are good to have because they're taking that fiduciary responsibility off the plate of the business owner. Otherwise, in a normal structure, if somebody gets ticked off and leaves the company and says, well, there was a bad mid-cap growth fund in here, I'm suing the employer. The employer, that's not their area of expertise. It's going to be very difficult for them to defend that. Whereas if they have a 338 investment manager, that 338 is taking the fiduciary responsibility for the fund selection. And then at that point, the employer just simply has a duty to monitor and make sure that advisor is doing what they're doing. You can never fully remove the fiduciary responsibility from the employer because ultimately they make some decision somewhere to even have a plan or to have, who the professionals are that are working on it. So you see the sales pitch out there sometime like, we remove fiduciary responsibility from the employer. It's like, no, you can't do that because they're still making a decision at some point. So, so that's kind of a newer component that you're seeing more in plans is that 338 fiduciary. And then sometimes if they have that, the other advisor maybe just wants to meet with the employees and do budgeting and cash flow and tax planning and that sort of stuff and doesn't really want to get into the fund selection. So, so that's where you'll see it sometimes broken up. For me, I don't mind taking the 338 responsibility. I don't mind picking the funds. I would feel awkward sitting in front of a participant with investments I didn't pick, but that's just a personal preference. It's not necessarily, right or wrong way to, and you get that on the individual side, right? So you have, TAMP programs and you have, financial planners where somebody else runs the money. So that's not very similar to the, individual side, but, you've done some great, work on the difference between an advisor and a broker and suitability versus, fiduciary responsibility. So, and the same sort of thing in the retirement plan world. It's evolved. Where I started it was more of a product that was sold, right? So it was kind of a benefits broker. They had 3 health insurance people that they were companies that they work with, and 3 401k companies that they work with. And which one do you want? Which one of these 3 insurance company 401k products can I sell you? Now it's hopefully moving more towards like a consultative, perspective and looking for different solutions. But yeah, I mean, it's still very much I think a broker dominated world, unfortunately, where it's more pushed as a product than a service. So
I agree with that. A couple other questions for you. One from Wendy. Do you have advice on how to advocate for your employer to allow the rule of 55? So maybe start with what rule of 55 is.
So that ties into some other questions too. So we had another question about in-plan Roth conversions and things like that. So the reason why a business owner wouldn't have those as part of the plan, first of all, it's usually just not a priority of theirs, and very few employees really know what that is or ask for it. And some of these plan documents haven't been updated in years. So I was looking at earlier the number of plans that have that even just have a Roth option anyway. It's still only about 75% of plans allow Roth contributions, which is crazy at this point, right? That there's still a quarter of the plans out there, but they just haven't been updated. The reason why it's just not a priority, and there's usually a cost that goes with updating a plan document. So if you're a small business and it's, $1,500 to update a plan document, you may put that off and wait. So it's usually a cost issue, or it's just not that common of a benefit. They're not going to spend $1,500 to appease one employee if there's, only 10 people working there. But I'd say all of those plan features, if there's issues like that, if you can get them together and update those all at once, it could be a cost. It's still going to be an expense for the business, but it could be a cost savings opportunity to add the Roth, add in-plan conversions, add, rule of 55, add certain plan features that you want to do all at once.
So like, what would the advice be for Wendy? Does she talk to HR? Does she gather up some friends around the water cooler and, go kick down the door and pitchforks and lanterns and, go create an uprising to do it? Or what's the best way to actually get some critical mass behind you?
Yeah. I mean, if she's got other employees there that can, sign a petition, but, something along those lines, just like, hey, we'd like to add these features, it would, it's just like any other sort of benefit, just have those conversations. You may even, if it's a situation where it's going to cost the business money, excuse me, you may even be able to approach it and say, hey, we think our plan is expensive in other areas. And if you look at the whole thing, you may be able to save $5,000 on record keeping. Yeah, maybe you've got to update your plan document, but it might save that. So, and one of the things too is if you're changing from one record keeper or administrator to another, typically they update that plan document as part of the transition. So rather than, it's kind of like the cable company, right? They give all the good deals to the new customers, and then a few years later, your bill goes up. But it's that same sort of principle where it's like, okay, if you move your plan to us, we'll update the plan document. So maybe it's that plan conversion that sort of brings it up to date. So, but yeah, I mean, so we were talking about before we started the show, if there's anybody out there in the group who has, fee disclosure or something, and they just want to say, hey, can you take a look at this and maybe give me 5 talking points with my boss at my year-end review, or something to go into the end of the year with, I'm happy to do those. I wouldn't charge those. I can, take a look through fee disclosures, plan documents, and give you some talking points. So feel free to, message me those or email those or whatever. I can help you out with that.
Cool. So there you go, Wendy. Maybe reach out to Brian and see what he can do. So similar type question, I guess, from Cody. Can you discuss some of the common features of plans found in the summary plan document, SPD, including in-service distributions and in-plan Roth conversions, early retirement? So, age 55 and Roth conversion topics are becoming more popular. We touched on some of it just now, but what other typical features do you see in what's called the summary plan document? And is that something you'd also be willing and able to review for someone if they wanted to kind of a second set of eyes on their plan?
Yeah, I would certainly be able to look at those. I mean, one of the things that's sort of happening now is, I guess it's probably a good time to touch on this, but so last summer with, don't worry, Cody, I'll get to your point eventually. I'll get there. But one of the things that happened last summer was the association retirement plan ruling. So that allowed for multiple employer plans to really become more common. So essentially what that is businesses banding together to be in the same plan. So we normally think about it as a cost structure or an efficiency structure, because you're only doing, one 5,500 for that whole group. So that could be a chamber of commerce or a manufacturing association that just provides this plan, and their members can adopt into it rather than having to start or maintain their own plan. And then also Secure Act came out at the end of 2019, which allowed for pooled employer plans, which are very similar, but you don't necessarily need that association connection. It's more driven by the industry, where the advisor or record keeper can kind of have their own pooled employer plan. So roundabout way of getting to back to the point is, with these type of multiple employer plans, some of those plan features are happen at the plan level, and then they're pushed out to all the adopting employers, all the different businesses. So rather than businesses needing to say, oh, geez, now we've got a new feature, we've got to go back and redo our plan document and summary plan description. It's more of kind of a top-down thing where the chamber or whatever pooled employer plan they would say, okay, we're adding this Roth, and then it automatically gets pushed out to all the employers. So that's an option too, if you're in sort of a smaller business and you know your employer doesn't want to go through the hassle of continually updating the documents with new features that come out. That's something that's becoming more common. But yeah, all those features are certainly more popular in new plans. You know, there, as plans come on board, you have a typical prototypical document, and it doesn't cost anymore to have those plans in the beginning. Some record keepers will charge, like, for that transaction. They might say, hey, if you want to do an in-plan Roth conversion, it's $50 for, you know, the labor, those kind of costs. You know, same thing with like a loan or a hardship. There might be a processing fee on that, but usually in the plan design, those things don't cost extra. But so again, so the multiple employer plan is an option for keeping your plan up to date, so you don't have to go through all that when it comes out.
Great. I guess quick one from Jackie, going back to 401ks, having to send you a paper check in the mail like it's 1970 or something. Why are 401k custodians still sending out paper checks when you roll the funds over to an IRA after you separate from the company? Seems like it's less secure than moving the funds electronically. Great question.
Yeah, that really is a great question. I think they're more concerned about the fraud aspect of it, or going into the wrong account. There is a school of thought, I guess, that mail is actually more secure. If they have to send it to your house and you've got to show ID and sign for it, that might be a little bit more secure than going company to company. I would obviously prefer company to company, because sometimes people lose checks, or they say, oh, I'll get to it, and then their 60 days is up, and then they've got an issue around that. But it is strange that they're not doing company. I had one, we were rolling out of Fidelity, and the guy hadn't worked there. I mean, I swear it was like 15 years. He hadn't worked. It was an old 403B plan, and they couldn't take his word to roll it to an IRA, and he was getting a check. They had to call his former employer and confirm that it was okay to do that. It was, again, one of those old plan documents that hadn't been updated. But you know, of course, they called over there and they had no idea who the guy was. He hadn't worked there in so long. But yeah, that is sort of an antiquated process. I'm sure they had a reason to do it. I mean, electronic is less expensive for them versus paper and mail. So I'm sure there's a reason behind it, but it's not one that I've heard a good reason for.
Okay. And one more here from Chris. This one's fairly topical and recent. So I heard of a proposal to allow a company to match student loan payments with a 401k contribution to help early career people build retirement savings. Any info on this? And does the current law require an employee contribution to get the company contribution?
Yeah, so there's a lot of those, you know, there's actually some adoption of those already, where employer contributions can go towards student loans. So the adoption rate is pretty low so far. About 3% of businesses have those, and it's more at the high end. So plans over $1 billion, it's, you know, a little over 4%, where there's not much adoption for under 5%. Right now, it's honestly a little bit more of the functionality of the record keeper. So this is a situation where the regulators are a little bit ahead of the technology, so to speak. So if you think of the different student loan providers and the different record keepers, who's going to talk to who, and who's the intermediary, and how can we, you know, because now it's something that's got to be reported on the statement and all that sort of stuff. So it's more of a compliance issue and a technology issue, but I think that's going to really explode within the next few years. I would definitely see more of that.
And was this, all these acts are blurring together. Was this Secure Act or CARES Act that put this in place? Or was it even before that?
Well, so it was even before that. I think I think Secure Act sort of moved it forward. I forget what they actually changed, but I know people were talking about this, 2 or 3 years ago, just having the record keepers facilitate that match. But I think some of the changes might be in like the safe harbor aspect of it, whether it could be the employer could use that safe harbor piece to fund the student loans.
And sort of second question from Chris here, I guess, does the employee need to make any contribution, or could the employer do its discretionary contribution as a student loan repayment? Do you know?
No, I think they're going to be set up where even if the employee isn't contributing, that employer piece could go to the student loan. So typically, there's situations where an employer will do a profit sharing contribution, or even in the simple, they may do a 2% contribution to everybody, whether the employee contributes or not. So, if the functionality is there to push that employer contribution to student loan, I don't think it would matter whether the employee contributed or not.
Okay, makes sense. All right, looks like we are caught up on the group questions for now.
Okay.
What else you got?
Yeah, so we could talk a little bit about, so we went back to the structure and sort of talk about some conflicts of interest. So if you look at the record keeping world a little bit, I think you've got a few categories there in my mind. I sort of categorize them. You've got your insurance companies, your Hancock, your Principal, your Empower. That's sort of the, I don't want to say older model, but traditional. It's sort of been around a little bit longer. You've got the companies with the investment management background. So think of your American funds, your JP Morgan. So they also have record keeping platforms that they use. Then you got the brokerage world. That's the Fidelity, the Schwab. Then I call it kind of the new age category. You've got a lot of these internet tech, startup kind of companies, your Guidelines, your 401go, Vestwell, sort of that next generation retirement platform. And then you've got your payroll companies, of course. You got Paychex and ADP, who are putting out a lot of plans on a pretty regular basis. So they all have their pros and cons. For me, I like to be on the independent side, so where there's no proprietary funds in the investment lineup at all. It's amazing how frequently that happens without any sort of check or balance in there. There's sometimes when it's appropriate, and I'd say when it's appropriate, it comes from the investment first, and then maybe that drives you to the record keeper. But doing it the other way around is just a significant issue. So if you think of that insurance company model, going back to our stable value discussion, so a lot of times what they'll do is they'll say, well, we'll price it a certain way if a certain amount of assets go to that stable value, because we'll make money on that spread that'll essentially pay for the record keeping costs, which in theory sounds good, except you've got a 60-year-old who might have half their balance in the stable value fund. And then you've got the 22-year-old who's putting all their money in the S&P 500 at 5 basis points. You have that 60-year-old is subsidizing all the record keeping costs for that person who's not in the stable value fund. So you get to all sort of issues like that. Ideally, everybody sort of stays in their lane. You have your record keeping platform. They charge a fee for the record keeping, and then they're out. You have your mutual funds, your CITs that are doing their job, running that pool of assets, and then they're out. And then ideally you have an independent advisor who's sort of overseeing that whole process. But yeah, the conflicts of interest, I think, are pretty severe. And it's going to be, well, we already said 5 times as many excessive fee lawsuits this year than any other year. So I think that's going to continue to be a hot button issue. Even in simple IRAs, and we were talking about this before you went live, you get that a lot because it's, it's broker sold a lot of times. So you might get some small simple IRA plans at a business, and they're all A shares, and that's how that broker is making their commission. Or, the fund companies have their own simple IRA platform. So you might have a simple IRA at work, and that's great. And you might have a list of 10 or 15 funds, but they might all be the same fund family. Not necessarily saying that's a, fiduciary issue, but it's a, plan structure issue that's not ideal. It's less than ideal. So, some people say, well, why don't we just do a simple? It's easy, or it doesn't cost anything. Well, that's one of those hidden costs, is the opportunity cost of having a much larger lineup. And a lot of those simple IRA plans are in really expensive share classes. So you look at that and they're, paying 130 basis points on these funds because they're in an expensive share class. Whereas if they were in a 401k platform, they might even be under 1%. So the fees are less transparent in a simple plan. So that's something to look for if you're in a simple IRA.
Yeah. And sort of related question just came in with two questions, but this one's kind of about fees and conflict of interest. Do 457 and 403A county funds have higher expense costs than 401k? Need to make a decision to roll out to IRA, but there is a stable value available that is better than CDs. What's your thoughts on that? I know a lot of 403Bs, there's so much conflict of interest, you can choke on it. 457 and 403As, what's your view?
Yeah, it really does depend on the plan. I mean, anything like those that's in that annuity wrapper, that's not in, mutual funds, that where you have a transparent share class. So
yeah,
a lot of times you might see, wow, I've got the Vanguard, mid cap index fund in my plan, but it's got, an insurance wrapper on it of 130 basis points. So it's like, you're not even actually in that fund. It looks like you are, but you're not. So, so that can be frustrating, but, yeah, I mean, it really is plan to plan. It is so different, depending on the size of the plan, but typically anything that's not in a mutual fund wrapper is usually going to be more expensive. So just take a look at their plan structure. And if you want to send me a fee disclosure, but do a good job looking at that stable value fund, because the crediting rate that they're showing you is after fees. So, so you're usually getting that full rate.
So unless that plan has crazy amount of like plan level fees that they take out of your account every year or quarter, the net return shown on stable value is already after fees. So if that's still impressively high, then maybe it makes sense to keep it and stay invested.
Yeah, I mean, typically you might see what's called like a contract charge or something like that. That could be between $25 and $50 a year, and that would be come out after your stable value interest. But yeah, I mean.
But 457s and 403As should have summary plan or fee disclosures kind of just the same as 401Ks, and that's something you'd be able to take a look at, perhaps.
Yeah, and it may even be a statement might be good enough, because you'll usually have all the investment options on there and the stable value rate on there too.
Okay. Another question from Wendy. This one's sort of about from the plan, the employer side. Company match policies can be quite different between company to company. Very generally, what factors are employers typically considering when they decide on the match they offer?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing, because you have really, honestly, the factor as business owners is how much they can put away. So if they're looking to max out, then they're going to do some sort of safe harbor contribution, because they don't want the plan to become top heavy, because they get that money back at the end of the year. So usually that's one of the first questions I ask is, who are the highly compensated employees? So that's defined as the owner, the family member, or people of a certain income level. So who are those, and are those people looking to max out? If they're not, then they don't have to worry about any top heavy issues there. So they could have a match, obviously, if they wanted to, but they don't have to. So usually that's the first question, and obviously the health of the business. I mean, if you're adding another 3% on top of your payroll, that can that could be a significant payroll, calculation. So, sometimes you hear in our industry that, the 401k and having a match helps with employee retention. And I get that, but I always kind of laugh a little bit, because that's more of a sales pitch than I think. I mean, you very rarely do you see somebody stay at a job they hate because the 401k match is good, or, vesting schedules. Well, we want to have a vesting schedule because it's going to keep our employees here. I mean, nobody's going to stay at a job they hate, an extra 2 years to pick up. So I think that's a little bit of an industry sales pitch, to be honest with you. But I think having some sort of, not necessarily pertaining to the match, but having some sort of workplace retirement account is obviously a beneficial, something to show your employees, at least that you're trying, at least that you're making an attempt to, sort of care about them outside of them being an employer. So being just an employee. So, talking about that, I mean, there's just a huge retirement gap coverage. I know in Connecticut, there's about 600,000 workers out of the 1.5 million that don't have access to any workplace retirement accounts. So not that they have one and not contributing, but, you know, and it's something like 50 million or 60 million nationwide that don't have access to any account.
Right.
So it's, you know, to us sounds crazy because it's not that hard to set up a plan, and, you know, not that hard to get something going. So there's no reason not to offer it. But you know, that falls back on us in the industry, not you and I specifically, Andy, but the industry in general, because, you know, small plans are profitable, startup plans are profitable. If you're somebody that bills on assets and there's zero assets in there from day one,
Right.
you know, they've just never been, you know, there's just never been that push. Small employers, it's not a top priority. And in the industry, we're not out there knocking on the door of the bakery with 5 employees to try to sell them something. So,
Sure.
you know, even when we're talking about 401k and employer sponsored plans, I think the most underutilized mechanism in the marketplace is the payroll deduction IRA, and almost nobody talks about it, but that's not an employer sponsored plan. Basically, you're just allowing somebody to come in and set up IRAs for your employees. You've got the IRA limits. There's not any, you know, there's no employer responsibility. There's no employer fees. They don't have to match. They're really just setting it up as an account, like a direct deposit. You're saying some of it's going into my bank, and then I'm going to put $25 a week in this IRA. And, you know, the limits for most people are pretty significant anyway. I mean, you're doing 6,000 or 7,000. You know, if you're over 50, you got the catch up. That's, you know, that's a pretty good amount of money for most of the savers out there. So, but again, it's one of those things that the industry doesn't push because there's not a lot of money in it. And, you know, people think people are pushing 401ks because there's, you know, money involved in record keeping and all that kind of stuff. But absolutely the payroll deduction IRA is very underrated in my opinion.
Could anyone do that? Anyone with an IRA and a active job with a paycheck, can they set that up, or you have to go through some sort of central admin person?
No, I mean, if you've got an IRA, a regular brokerage account number, TD, Schwab, Fidelity, whatever, it probably comes with a routing number, same as on the bottom of your checks.
Okay.
And you're just giving that to payroll, and saying, I'd like $25 a week put into this account, and it's treated like any other account. So, but I think that's a really underrated feature. And, you know, and one of the things we were going to talk about is the state plans briefly, but that's really what the state plans are. So you have states like California, Oregon, Illinois are in full swing with their mandatory programs. So basically what those are is the state is saying, if you have more than 5 employees, you have to offer your employees a retirement savings plan. So you can go out and get a 401k or a simple, or you can go through the state plan. And the state plan is payroll deduction IRAs. That's all they are. So they're taking an index fund and some other you know, target date funds and putting together that almost like the TSP type program. They're like a real skinny, efficient lineup. And then they're tacking on like, you know, 80 basis points of record keeping. So they do tend to be a little bit more expensive, but that's basically what they're doing at the state level, is a state sponsored payroll IRA deduction program. So to me, I'm looking at that and I'm saying, okay, I get it. I understand what they're doing, and they're, you know, maybe their heart's in the right place, so to speak, but it's still kind of expensive. But again, they're dealing with really small balances, so it doesn't necessarily, you know, hit the people right away. You know, if you've got a $500 balance and it's, you know, 20 basis points more expensive than it should be, it's not that big a deal. But but for the most part, I think people can do better than those state plans. But I give the states a lot of credit. At least they're, you know, bringing the issue to the table. They're pushing it out there. And you know, even the folks at Cal Savers, I've been on a lot of their webinars. They're saying, hey, listen, we're not trying to compete with the private sector at all. If us having this program forces you to go out and get a 401k, that's great. That's still a win for us. So, yeah, those state plans, most states at least have something in the hopper now, or they're putting something together. I don't know, with this administration, they may go back to some sort of federal IRA type program, which was talked about during the My IRA during the Obama era. So maybe we'll do something at the national level. But yeah, those are payroll deduction IRA programs. Businesses can do those without the state, and they're probably going to be about half the cost. But again, it's finding an advisor who's willing to, take the time to do that and
Relatively
set
small.
that sort of,
Interesting question from Jackie. She's noticed that companies are starting to allow employees to have 401k loan after separating service to continue paying back the loan even after they leave. In the past, the loan almost always had to be paid back within 60 days. And I think this got extended to a year, or else it would be considered a withdrawal. What are you seeing with changes in the rules with 401k loans?
Yeah, 401k loans is one of those interesting plan design features where it sometimes gets abused. People pay back their loan, and as soon as they pay it off, they go right back. So you got these serial loan people, and they take it out to buy a boat or things like that. So you'll have employers say absolutely no loans because it gets abused. I like to have it available just because, people run into things happen.
Sure.
So, loans and hardships are sort of lumped together there, but I like to have those available in the plans just because things happen. You'll get people who do abuse it, absolutely. But I like to have those available as far as a plan design thing. Paying the money back after separation, it's one of those things it's almost more of a technology function than it is a plan design issue. So some companies will take that if you write a check and send it back, and as long as you continue to pay it, they'll mark it as paid as long as you continue to pay it after you've separated from service. So some of them are good like that. Some of them will even set up an ACH with your checking account to automatically pay the loans back. So you are seeing that as more of a technology function that is rolling out. But that's one of the things we always tell people when you take a loan. Hey, if you're thinking about switching jobs, or you're think you might run into an issue where you might be terminated, be careful with the loan, because it does come due, and it is taxable and penalty and all that kind of stuff. But at least from my standpoint, I still think plans should have loans and hardships available. But that's just a personal preference.
Do you know what is the IRS max time limit to pay it back after separation?
I don't think it's a max time limit. I think it's based on the original terms of so if you take a 60 month loan and 1 month in you get terminated, I think you can pay it back for 59 months if you choose to.
But that's if the IRS allows it. It sounds like the company / plan could force you and require you to do it immediately at one extreme, or some other day. Okay.
Yeah, it's usually the most restrictive I've seen is like 30 or 60 days.
Okay.
Where you're terminated, you've got to pay it back in that time. But it's one of those things that's a plan design issue versus an IRS rule on that.
Got it. From Cody, what do you think about the new tools to help employee investment behavior, including auto enrollment, auto escalation, and target date plans? Do you think some of these will become the norm for new plans?
Absolutely. I think, and even some of there's sort of a Secure Act 2 legislation popping around that's going to make auto enrollment almost mandatory, I think, on the simple IRA plans and stuff. But Secure Act that came out in December of 2019 put in a $500 tax credit for businesses who adopt auto enrollment. So that's for new plans. So it's almost automatic that you include automatic enrollment. Even if you have an existing plan and you add automatic enrollment, you still get that $500 tax credit. So, so it's really kind of a no-brainer that you do that. Most bigger companies are doing that, but on the small company side, at least with me, I'm going to be in there. I'm going to be active anyway. So they're going to have plenty of time to opt out of that if they don't want to do it. You're even seeing some record keepers who will facilitate a 60-day give back or something. So somebody gets automatically enrolled at their new job, get their first pay stub. Hey, what the heck is this money being taken out? I don't want it. And they've got, $23 in their 401k. The record company will just push it back to them. And so I think if you have those kind of features and your communication with your employees, there's no reason not to have automatic enrollment.
Sure.
I'll say that the downside of automatic enrollment is they're typically around, 3% is kind of the standard. So you may actually have an employee who if they had done it on their own, might have selected 5%, might have selected 10%, but they get defaulted in that because they think, oh, well, somebody somewhere is telling me that that's the okay number.
Right.
So, you know, it might take them, even if they've got auto increase, it might take them 7 years to get back to the 10% that they might have done right away. If, you know, you're sort of, you know, unconsciously, you didn't even know what, you know, you're 22 years old or something. You don't know, okay, I'll put away 10%. What do I know? You know, I'm living at home and whatever. So it may actually deter people who might have saved a little bit more. I think that's sort of a downside to it, but I think auto increase is great. You know, it's kind of, you know, I think it's pretty standard at this point. Almost all the new plans that I've done have done automatic enrollment. And you can do it a couple different ways too. So you could say, you know, if you're starting a retirement plan and you've already got 30 employees, you don't necessarily have to automatically enroll them if they're not in the plan. You could just say, you know, starting January 1st, 2021, any new hire is automatically enrolled. So you have some businesses doing that.
Okay. Here's looks to be a little bit of a prickly one from Ria. I work in payroll, and one employee asked to sign up for our 401k in 2018, and my payroll person never signed her up. Employee submitted all forms. The employee did not notice that she was not having deduction until today. What is employer's responsibility at this point to make employee whole?
Yeah, I mean, they've got to go back and do the calculations as if the money was there. So it's, you know, figuring out what her investment was. You know, if it's a mutual fund, makes it a little bit easier. You go back and you get the historical NAV and just kind of have to mark it back each payroll. You know, there's certain tools, you know, through Morningstar and things that you could do, but yeah, that is an issue.
Do you think the employer actually has to under their fiduciary responsibility, or is this something that, or is it gray, or is it simply employee should have known because she should have seen it come out of her paycheck and wasn't paying attention for 2 years?
I think it goes back to the original documentation. I mean, if the employees got a form that they emailed or got a copy of it, I mean, I guess in theory, the employer could say, well, they never told us. They're just saying they signed up 2 years ago. I mean, I guess in theory, you could go that route if you're the employer, but if you've got any sort of documentation, certainly the employer has to go back and fix it
and make it whole, especially since since it was a hot few years since 2018. So
well, yeah, I mean, and then and then you get into, you know, refiling taxes and things like that too. So
interesting. So right. So that would mean employees' tax returns would have been wrong 2018, 2019.
Mm-hmm.
So now I guess this starts to get ugly where should the employer also be responsible to pay the tax prep fees for this person to have to amend their returns now?
Yeah, I mean, they probably should. I don't know the exact rules on all that. I haven't seen one that's gone that long.
Yeah.
So don't want to make a legal comment one way or another, but I mean, a good employer should find a way to make that right somehow.
Okay.
Give an extra week of vacation or something.
Do
something. Come to some sort of an agreement there.
Okay. Yeah, it makes sense. Okay, that's we're up on the questions for now. I have a general. I think everyone may be interested in this. So just thinking, you know, fees are top of mind for everyone, and rightfully so. Now, fees aren't everything in a plan, but I think everyone in this group is more or less familiar with expense ratios in a mutual fund or an ETF, right? You don't pay it explicitly, but you know it comes out of your fund every year. So other than expense ratios in the funds in your plan, we also touched on there's administrative fees, record keeping fees, whatever. What are average fees? And then, you know, by extension, what's good, what's bad? So if and when people look at their fee disclosures and see not only their expense ratios, but other stuff, what should they hopefully see?
Yeah, good question. One that's not really a short answer, of course. But so one thing I'd point out early is record keeping costs can sometimes be a percentage of assets, or it could be a flat dollar. So let's think of a couple examples. You start working at a company and you've got, you know, $8,000 in your plan, and you're paying record keeping fees that are a flat dollar amount. So you may calculate back and find out that that's a high percentage, you know, and you see in groups and Facebook, not this group, because this group's smarter than that, but you'll see somebody say, oh my goodness, my fees are 2%, my 401k stinks, without any context of how big the plan is, how much money they've got in their account. So So my question is, well, is it actually 2% or is it calculated at 2%, right? Because that may, if your fees are $50 a year and you've got $500 in your account, well, yeah, your fees are 10%, but so that's something to look at too. More record keepers, I think, are moving towards a flat dollar amount, which in my opinion is a little more fair. It doesn't cost more to record keep $100,000 account than it does a $10,000 account. You know, my joke is that, yeah, they got to use more ink on the statement and maybe it's a little heavier to mail. So maybe the postage goes up, but it doesn't necessarily cost more to record keep that. That's probably an overly simple answer because they still have to operate a call center. And if somebody takes a trade that the trade is wrong and they've got a trade error on a bigger account, it does cost them more. So you can kind of argue both sides of that, but I'd say that's one of the things you want to look at is, okay, what are those fixed fees? And then maybe look at them at different balances as you progress. You know, 401k, when you've got a $10,000 balance, may look a lot nicer when you've got a $20,000 balance if your fees are more on the fixed side. But if you're looking at the short answer, in my opinion, 1% is kind of that over under number. You know, if you can get in at everything under 1%, I think that's a good way to go. So I'll touch briefly on revenue sharing too. So it kind of sounds like a dirty word, and if you explain it, dirty term. And if you explain it, sometimes it does. But let's say, for example, you have an S&P fund and it's charging 1%, right? And you're going to see on the message board, oh my goodness, my S&P 500, it charges 1%. What a scam. So that fund might actually be paying revenue sharing that's subsidizing some costs to the plan. So you may find out that there's 80 basis points of revenue sharing in there, and 50 of that is paying the advisor, and then 30 of that is paying the record keeping costs. And maybe there's no additional fees on top of that. So the fact that fund might look expensive, they may be crediting back. So I don't like that setup. I would prefer to build it up, and I'll get into that in a second, but I prefer each fee to sort of be disclosed and be easier to calculate it and just a little bit more transparent. The other way would be to add to take the 15 basis point, you know, S&P 500 fund, and then add your advisor fee on top of that, and then add your record keeping fees on top of that. But in a lot of cases, you're going to end up in the same spot anyway. So a practical application would be, I take over a 401k plan, and they've got that system with the 1% S&P 500 fund. So I could blow up the whole plan, put the Vanguard S&P 500 in, and then add the other two fees on top of it. And end up in the same spot anyway. So it's kind of like the total cost. And that's happened to me where I've taken over a plan and said, I'm going to be the good guy. I'm going to be transparent. I'm going to do all this stuff. And you explain it to the group, and then you do your first group meeting and somebody says, hey, how come I'm paying all these fees? I never had to pay these fees before. Guaranteed happens every single time. So when you think about participant behavior, that may actually cause that person to say, this 401k stinks. We've got to pay all these fees now. I'm not going to contribute anymore. You know, so you get a bad participant experience by making the fees, even though they were there the whole time, and you didn't change the fees at all by showing that the way they're viewed. So again, it's one of those things that you know, it's about the total cost of the plan, but it's about the total cost of the plan at different balance levels too. So so there's not an easy answer, and most advisors don't even really understand how all that works together. But but if you can sit down with a spreadsheet and kind of play around with it, or send it over to me, I'll take a look at it. But the quick answer is, that 1%, that's kind of the over under.
Okay. And speaking of, most advisors don't understand, Jackie asks, is the revenue sharing the same as 12B1 fees?
Yes. Good point.
And now, what are those? Like, those are these mystical unicorn type things. We don't really know what they are, but they're often there, and it ends up it's just like extra money that's going to someone.
Yeah, right. It was originally a marketing expense, right? So the idea was mutual funds are built and they have a fixed fee model, but as the fund gets bigger, that fix becomes a smaller fee percentage wise. So you, Andy, as the shareholder, should pay the mutual fund company to market this mutual fund so that it gets bigger, so that your costs go down. That was kind of the idea going way back. So it's kind of a legacy. I think those are, all that stuff is kind of going away by the next generation advisors like us who don't deal in that kind of nonsense. So it's
Right.
still more prevalent in the 401k world or for the simple world. But ideally, if I'm designing a plan, it's all institutional share classes with no revenue sharing, and then build each component on top of it.
Separate, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Looks like the questions have trickled off, and we're after 9 at this point, 9 on the East Coast. Any final sort of parting thoughts or other things you want to touch on before we wrap here?
I don't think so. I had an outline. I think we touched on most of the stuff. The other thing I would add in to, and I'll post this on the group page later, is 5500 data. That's the tax form that each 401k has to file every year. That's all public information. So if you have questions about your 401k structure, even who the signers are, who the decision makers, that's all public information on the Department of Labor website. And you can actually see going back a few years. If your plan has more than 100 participants, you have to file a long form 5500, which gives some additional data, and it has to go through an audit. So there'll also be an auditor's report attached to that. So, but that's a gold mine for finding fees and things like that. So that's just another resource.
So 5500, and you can just Google Department of Labor 5500 search or something.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And you can look at that plan, and you can even compare it to similar plans in the area of similar size and that sort of stuff. So they just revamped the website. It's pretty good, actually.
Okay. Well, cool. Awesome. This was very helpful. Lots of great questions. Again, Brian, where can people go to find out more about you, or if they want to work with you or send you these fee disclosures or summary descriptions?
Yeah. So, all the normal spots. I'm part of the group. You can always, message me stuff. Website's northshireconsulting.com. I also run chamber401ks.com, which is also that association sort of retirement plan model that I think kind of works. So people who are members of associations, they might want to bring that up at a board meeting or something, because I think that's sort of the next wave. There's no reason for businesses all to be running their own 401k plans at this point. So chamber401ks.com, northshireconsulting.com, email, call, whatever. I'm around.
Awesome. And as people here have seen, I mean, Brian is the group's resident 401k expert. So if and when you have plan related questions, Brian's the guy to tag in one of your posts here. All right.
Thanks.
That's it. Well, thank you, Brian. This was very good. Thanks for coming on. I think people got a lot out of it, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks, Andy.
Cool. Take care, all. Bye-bye.